I knew I was in trouble the moment I saw Jolene Zimmer's name on the company-wide email. Please welcome Jolene Zimmer as our new regional operations manager. Jolene, HOA president, neighborhood tyrant. The woman who once fined me $100 for unauthorized mailbox paint. And now she was my boss. Let me rewind. I'm Preston Carter, 38, logistics supervisor, and unfortunately, a homeowner in the East Haven Oaks neighborhood, a place that looks perfect on the outside, but is ruled by an HOA so power-hungry, it makes Congress look chill. Jolene Zimmer was the face of that madness. Blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, and a permanent look of disapproval. She ran the HOA like a dictator with a garden clipboard. She once held a vote to ban unsightly garage decor. I had a vintage Route 66 sign in my garage. You can guess how that went. So when she strutted into the Monday morning staff meeting in the same smug heels I'd seen clacking down my driveway last month, I nearly choked on my coffee. "Good morning, everyone," she said, in that chirpy yet condescending tone. "I'm very excited to bring East Haven values to our office culture." East Haven values. What passive-aggressive notes and surveillance. She didn't acknowledge me when we made eye contact, but I knew she remembered. How could she forget the guy who called her out in front of the HOA board meeting for manipulating the landscaping budget with her cousin's overpriced lawn service? By Friday, she'd rearranged the seating chart. I'd been moved to a cubicle near the printer, loud, dusty, and directly under a flickering fluorescent light. When I asked Jolene why, she said, "Preston, I think a little less distraction will help you focus. You've always struck me as independent." Translation: she wanted me isolated. It got worse. She started micromanaging everything I did. "Preston, I noticed you used a blue folder for the vendor files. Standard is gray. Preston, we've decided your flexible hours are no longer appropriate. We need consistent visibility." And the kicker: "Preston, I'll need to pre-approve any of your emails to external partners." I stared at her. "You want to approve my emails?" She gave me the same look she gave my kid, Henry, when he rode his scooter 2 inches onto HOA grass. "Just until I'm confident in your tone." I knew what this was. She couldn't stand that I embarrassed her back at the neighborhood meeting. Now she had power over me and she was using it like a crowbar, but I wasn't just going to take it. What Jolene didn't know was that I'd kept records. Of everything. HOA budgets, vote records, committee conflicts, even a few shady landscaping invoices that mysteriously matched her friend's business address. And more importantly, I had a plan. Because if Jolene thought she could bring her HOA nonsense into my workplace and get away with it, she had no idea who she was messing with. I waited exactly 6 days before making my move, not because I was nervous. I was patient. Jolene wasn't just overreaching, she was setting herself up. All I had to do was let her keep pulling the leash until she choked on it. It started with the budget. I'd worked in operations long enough to know how to read financials like a roadmap. Our department's quarterly expense report was due, and Jolene wanted me to clean up the supplier list. What she meant by clean up was axe 2 vendors and replace them with one she recommended. She handed me a printed quote, stapled neatly, from a logistics firm I'd never heard of, Pineway Distribution. I looked it over. Rates were unusually high, and the address: a nondescript warehouse suite on the edge of town that used to belong to a defunct garden supply company. "Pineway's team is very responsive," Jolene said, tapping the paper, "and they do things the East Haven way. I trust them." I paused. "Have they worked with us before?" "I've worked with them," she said, voice clipped. "They handled HOA shipments for our community events." That was all I needed to hear. I made a copy of the quote, then ran a quiet background check through a friend in procurement. Pineway Distribution had no official website, no employee directory, and no online reviews. But the business license registered to a Margaret Zimmer, Jolene's mother. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I updated the vendor list as requested but sent the original version to the CFO's office with a note that said, "Per Jolene's directive, please disregard this version. For audit trail only." That was step 1. Step 2 came the following Tuesday, when Jolene decided to revamp office culture. She called a mandatory team meeting in the main conference room and rolled out her masterpiece, a printed code of conduct with color-coded behavior tiers. It looked like something out of a dystopian preschool. Level green, collaborative and neighborly. Level yellow, disruptive tendencies. Level red, toxic behavior requiring intervention. She actually used the term neighborly in a corporate setting. I'll be documenting daily behavior and sharing monthly evaluations, she announced. We're building a values-driven environment. I raised my hand. Who decides what's considered toxic? I do, she said without blinking. I leaned back in my chair. Perfect. Later that day, Maribel from HR stopped me in the hallway. She looked exhausted. Preston, she just made me rewrite the employee handbook to include a dress code for visual harmony. What does that even mean? She's trying to turn the office into a gated community, I said. She's just missing the white fences, Maribel sighed. I think she's trying to push half of us out. That's when I realized Jolene wasn't just power tripping, she was actively restructuring. She'd already reassigned 3 project leads, slashed remote time for parents, and shut down the wellness stipend, calling it non-essential. I wasn't the only one in her crosshairs, so I started gathering. I didn't use anything from the HOA files, yet I didn't need to. Jolene was making enemies faster than I could keep track. I documented every policy change, every vendor switch, every reassigned team member. I interviewed 2 interns, both said she'd asked them to spy on coworkers and report back with attitude notes. By the end of the second week, I had a 32-page dossier. Then came the day everything cracked. It started with a fire alarm. Just after lunch, sirens blared through the building. We evacuated to the parking lot. Fire trucks arrived. Nothing was burning, but the alarm hadn't been triggered by accident. Someone had pulled it. While we stood outside, Jolene marched up to the fire marshal like she owned the place. I demand to know who pulled it, she barked. This is a deliberate disruption. I want names. The marshal calmly handed her a citation. Ma'am, we have surveillance footage, he said. It was pulled by someone matching your description. She froze. He continued, you're aware that pulling a fire alarm without cause is a misdemeanor under state law. I was testing response time, she said, arms crossed. Ma'am, this is not a drill facility. This is a place of business. The fire marshal handed her a second form. We'll be filing a report. I caught the moment her jaw tightened. She tried to argue, but the marshal had already turned away. By the next morning, word had spread. Jolene tried to spin it in an all-staff email titled Clarification on Emergency Preparedness Initiative, but it backfired. Half the staff replied all, including a reply from our CEO's executive assistant. Please refrain from mass disruptions. We have real work to do. That afternoon, I booked a 15-minute slot with the CFO. I brought the dossier. I didn't need a long speech. I laid out the vendor conflict, the fabricated behavior system, the internal restructuring without HR sign-off, and the fire alarm stunt. The CFO flipped through the pages slowly. He didn't say much, just nodded once and said, "Leave this with me." 2 days later, they held a leadership meeting. Jolene wasn't invited. By Friday, the entire company received an email from corporate. Effective immediately, all departmental restructuring is suspended pending audit review. Jolene Zimmer will be transitioning into a non-supervisory role. She was demoted, no office, no staff. No vendor authority. I passed her in the hallway that afternoon. She was clearing out her desk, her face pale. For the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't say a word to me. No glare, no comments, just silence. It was almost disappointing. Almost. Maribel walked by, holding a box of HR files. Guess she'll have time to focus on that HOA now. I grinned. Yeah, and maybe repaint her own mailbox for once, but I wasn't done. Because the audit, it uncovered something worse. 2 community invoices routed through the company's logistics account, one for event rentals, one for community security. Both tied to HOA activity. Both billed under Pineway distribution. When the finance department traced the charges, they found the funds had been redirected into a private account connected to Jolene's family trust. That's embezzlement. Corporate handed the case to the authorities. Police showed up the following week, quietly. No sirens. Jolene was escorted out through the side stairwell, no cuffs yet, but the investigation was real. Word spread fast, and back in East Haven Oaks, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. A neighbor sent me a photo that night. Jolene's HOA nameplate, removed from the community board, lying face down in the grass. The caption read, "Guess she's not running the neighborhood anymore." I looked at the picture, then closed the message and stepped out onto the porch. The air felt lighter. No clipboard patrols, no passive-aggressive newsletters, just my house, my yard, and one less tyrant in the world. And for the first time in a long while, East Haven Oaks finally felt like home. The following Monday felt like someone had opened a window after years of breathing stale air. The office buzzed not with fear, but with cautious optimism. Jolene's glass nameplate had been removed, her desk reassigned to a junior analyst, and the constant micromanagement that haunted every task vanished overnight. The entire floor exhaled, but I wasn't celebrating yet, because something still didn't sit right. The audit had caught the Pineway invoices, sure, but the amounts were oddly specific: 2 transfers, both under $25,000, just low enough to dodge mandatory internal investigation triggers. That didn't feel careless, that felt calculated, so I started digging again. This time, I looked beyond our company's financials. I knew Jolene had used Pineway for HOA-related expenses, and I suspected she'd been doing it long before she ever showed up at our office. The HOA's financials weren't public by default, but as a homeowner, I had a legal right to request access to them. Most people don't know that. Jolene had counted on that ignorance. I filed a formal records request with the HOA under Florida Statute 720.303. They had 10 business days to comply. On day 8, I got a reply. The documents were a mess. Receipts were scanned sideways or cut off, some were handwritten with no vendor detail, and several were simply missing. But one thing stood out immediately. Pineway Distribution had been paid monthly for community security enhancements going back almost 2 years. Every payment was just under $25,000. Everyone approved by Jolene's signature. I cross-referenced the dates with the HOA meeting minutes. There was no record of any vote approving security upgrades. In fact, during 2 of those months, no meetings were held at all. That was illegal. Worse, Pineway had also received payments for community event logistics, which included stage rentals, fencing, and portable restrooms. But I recognized the restroom vendor listed on the receipts. It was the same one we'd used at the warehouse for a totally unrelated corporate event 6 months ago. I called the company and asked, hypothetically, if they'd ever worked in East Haven Oaks. The manager on the line paused. "No, we only service industrial zones. Never done a residential event in that area." So the receipts were fabricated. That's when I called in a favor. My cousin Rachel worked in the county inspector general's office. She couldn't launch a formal investigation off a family tip, but she could tell me where to file the complaint and how to present the evidence cleanly. I spent 2 nights organizing everything: scanned bank records, HOA meeting documents, vendor correspondence, and a timeline that connected it all. I submitted the complaint anonymously. 2 weeks later, I saw the first sign it had reached someone important: a dark gray sedan with county plates parked across the street from Jolene's home. A man and a woman in plain clothes stepped out and walked up her driveway. They didn't knock. They rang the bell and waited with clipboards in hand. She opened the door. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I didn't need to. Her voice rose sharply, her hands flailing in visible panic. The agents stayed calm. One of them handed her a folder. She stopped talking. The next day, the HOA website went down. By the weekend, a notice was posted at the community clubhouse. Emergency HOA meeting, mandatory attendance, legal and compliance discussion. Curious, I went. The room was packed. Homeowners who hadn't shown up in years were there, some standing in the back. The air was thick with tension. Jolene wasn't at the front table. Instead, a man in a gray suit introduced himself as an external compliance officer from the state HOA regulatory board. He didn't waste time. "Several financial irregularities have been discovered in this community's recent accounting history," he began. These include unauthorized vendor payments, falsified meeting records, and expenditures without proper board approval. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The officer continued. We've initiated a forensic audit. If criminal activity is confirmed, charges will be filed. A woman near the front raised her hand. What kind of charges? Fraud, misappropriation of community funds, and willful neglect of state HOA statutes, he replied. Depending on the findings, potential felony charges are on the table. A man in the back said, "Is Jolene going to jail?" The officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, I got an email from a neighbor I barely knew, Carl, a retired Air Force mechanic who'd lived in East Haven Oaks since it was built. "You lit the fuse," he wrote. "About time someone did." For the next few weeks, the neighborhood transformed. The HOA board was suspended pending investigation. An interim committee was formed, made up of volunteers from the community. Carl joined it. So did a nurse named Tanya, a local teacher, and even Maribel from HR apparently. She lived 2 streets over and had also been quietly collecting HOA fines for having a compost bin. Together, they began combing through years of neglected documents. What they found was worse than anyone expected. Jolene had created an inner circle years ago, just 3 board members who always voted with her. They'd quietly removed spending caps from the bylaws, redirected maintenance funds into beautification reserves, and contracted services exclusively from companies tied to her extended family. She'd even paid herself a management bonus of $10,000 2 years in a row, something explicitly banned under the HOA's own charter. The county's fraud division got involved. Then came the search warrant. On a rainy Thursday morning, 3 unmarked vehicles pulled into Jolene's driveway. Officers entered with gloves and evidence boxes. Neighbors stood under umbrellas, watching in silence. No one looked surprised. She was driven away in the back of a county vehicle. Charged with wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud homeowners, and falsification of public records. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen. A restitution fund was created. A judge ordered the liquidation of Pineway Distribution's assets. Turns out, the company existed only on paper, with no employees and no legitimate services. The restitution fund would take time, but checks began arriving months later. My mailbox held a plain envelope with a county seal. Inside was a reimbursement check for every fine I'd ever paid plus interest. The community held a block party the following weekend. First one in years, no permits, no board approval, no clipboards, just tables, lights, music, and neighbors who finally had something worth celebrating. I brought my son Henry. He rode his scooter down the middle of the street, laughing, no one stopping him. Tanya grilled hot dogs. Carl set up a tent with drinks. Even the old couple from the corner house came out, smiling for the first time in ages. Someone asked me if I planned to run for the new board. I shook my head. "I've done my part," I said. "Time to let the neighborhood breathe." But later that night, after the music had faded and most people had gone home, I sat on my porch and watched the lights twinkle across the street. I thought about how one woman's obsession with control nearly tore a community apart and how close she came to getting away with it. She tried to control my workplace, my home, even my mailbox. Now she was facing up to 20 years. All because she underestimated one thing: people don't like being pushed forever. Eventually, they push back. 3 weeks after Jolene's arrest, the mood across East Haven Oaks had shifted from disbelief to resolve. The community, once divided by whispered threats and petty fines, was coming together in a way I hadn't seen since moving in. People were repainting fences not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Front porches that used to be tight-lipped and guarded were hosting game nights and potlucks. But just as the HOA's grip was loosening, new questions began circulating. Where had all the money really gone? The restitution fund was a start, but the numbers didn't add up. The county report estimated over $200,000 in redirected funds across 3 years, yet only a fraction had been recovered from the frozen Pineway account. It became clear Jolene hadn't acted entirely alone. That's when someone mentioned Trevor Odell. He'd served quietly as HOA treasurer for the past 4 years, rarely speaking at meetings, always sitting one chair away from Jolene. I remembered once seeing him at a vote he abstained but nodded when she glanced over. Back then, I thought it was indifference. Now, it looked like complicity. Carl brought it up during one of the new board's open forums. He handled the books. She signed the checks, but he's the one who moved the numbers, Carl said, holding up a printed ledger sheet. Look at this. He created a shell sub-account labeled Emergency Reserve Fund B. That's where the duplicate payments were routed. The county's audit had missed it. It was disguised as an internal ledger shift, not an external transaction. Tanya, now interim board chair, leaned forward. If that's true, we need to report it. Immediately. I made the call myself. The district attorney's office took interest within days. A financial crimes investigator followed up with a subpoena for HOA digital records. The password-protected spreadsheets Trevor had used were unlocked by a forensic tech in under an hour. Inside were detailed logs of every manipulated entry. Emails between Trevor and Jolene showed coordination. They had created fake invoices, rerouted budget lines, and even drafted scripts for meetings to make it appear as though votes had occurred. In one message, she wrote, "If anyone asks, say it was a unanimous decision from the Finance Subcommittee." No one ever checks the minutes. This went far beyond HOA corruption. It was organized fraud. The DA filed charges against Trevor within the week: conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of financial documents, and aiding in misappropriation of community funds. He was arrested at his accounting firm during lunch. The news made local headlines. Now there were two. Meanwhile, at work, Jolene's name had become radioactive. No one mentioned her unless it was to joke about the office finally being able to breathe again. Her office had been reconfigured into a quiet room, her picture removed from the leadership wall. The company issued a formal statement distancing itself from her actions, but there was one last bit of fallout I had to clean up. The vendor contracts she'd pushed through at the office, especially Pineway, had to be terminated. Legal reviewed them and found that she'd bypassed standard bidding procedures and forged internal approval signatures. When that came out, our corporate legal counsel notified the board of directors. They launched a full compliance investigation across all regional offices. I was asked to sit in on a review panel for a new oversight committee. I accepted. During the first meeting, Sylvia from legal turned to me. "Honestly, Preston, if you hadn't flagged this when you did, we might not have caught it until the next fiscal year." She almost embedded that entire network into our vendor pipeline. I nodded. She'd done it before. She just scaled it here. Sylvia looked thoughtful. "You ever think about moving up? Regional compliance manager's position just opened." I didn't answer right away. The truth was, the past few months had been a crash course in everything wrong with unchecked authority, how easily power could be abused when no one was watching, and how dangerous it was to assume silence meant agreement. "I'll think about it," I said finally. She smiled. "We'd be lucky to have you." Back in the neighborhood, the interim board voted to rewrite the entire HOA charter. Gone were the closed-door sessions and vague beautification clauses. New rules required full transparency, public votes, open access to records, and a rotating leadership to prevent entrenchment. Tanya suggested a quarterly neighborhood report be mailed out with spending summaries and upcoming initiatives. The changes passed with overwhelming support. But there was one final piece of unfinished business: Jolene's trial. It began 6 months after her arrest and lasted just over a week. The prosecution laid out a meticulous case: emails, financial documents, altered minutes, and testimony from former board members who had been coerced or misled. They painted a picture of someone who used fear and manipulation to build a private empire from public funds. Her defense argued she was overzealous and had made administrative errors. The jury returned a verdict in under 4 hours, guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge didn't hold back. He called her actions a betrayal of community trust and a pattern of calculated deception. She was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, with restitution payments required upon parole. Trevor took a plea deal. 18 months, 5 years probation, and full cooperation with the ongoing civil recovery process. After the trial, Tanya and Carl organized a community gathering, not a celebration, but a moment of reflection. It was held on the same stretch of green space where Jolene once tried to ban lawn chairs without HOA-approved designs. Neighbors brought food. Someone set up a projector and played a slideshow of before and after photos. Cracked sidewalks now repaired, abandoned flower beds blooming, and community events that felt for the first time in years like something real. Carl stood up and looked around. We didn't just fix the books. We fixed the foundation. A few heads nodded. Others clapped softly. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. As the sun started to set, Henry tugged on my sleeve. Can I ride my scooter down the hill? I looked around. No one watching. No one measuring grass height or checking helmet colors. Go ahead, I said. He flew down the path, laughing. I stayed a moment longer, watching the porch lights flicker on across the neighborhood. The same streets that once felt like a trap now felt like part of something I'd help rebuild. On Monday, I accepted the compliance manager position. Not for the title, not for the office, but because I'd seen what happened when no one paid attention, and I wasn't about to let that happen again.